right.
Yeah.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. I'm with my co host, Rania, who is drinking wine and
Yeah.
enjoying
And it's
herself.
okay. It's okay because it's past 5 o'clock. I just want
Yeah,
it's like a PSA.
She's living in
Only
the
drink after
future.
5 in
we're
the future.
here with our guest for the week, Abby Martin, the host of the Empire Files, who's also, are you just back? You're just back from Alaska working on your film, Earth's Greatest Enemy. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah. This is going to be awesome. No, I'm so happy to have you on, Abby. It's been a while. I think this is the first time we've had you on video.
Yeah.
I think it's like the last time we had you on, I think like it was a crossover episode between our show and
yeah.
Media Roots, which
Yeah.
was a while ago. So since then there's been like a pandemic, there's been lots of wonderful life changes for so many of us. But I guess the best place to start, which I imagine where Kevin was going to go, is that you did just come back from this trip for your upcoming film, which looks so amazing and is on the issue of climate change, but from a lens through which climate change is never covered. So why don't you give our listeners and viewers an idea of what your film's about and why it's so important?
Yeah, this is obviously a huge issue that I think is the most pressing issue of our time, quite clearly and obviously. Just the fact that, history repeats itself through all of these things that we see, these crises of war and imperialism. But what is different about the time that we're living in, of course, is the cataclysmic climate change that is happening very rapidly. It's undeniable at this point. You just have to look out your window and see that the widespread fires in California, Oregon, Washington, the mega droughts that are soon to come, which could be months or years at a time in the Midwest, the horrific storms that are taking place. Look at New York, where water is just pouring down the subways, storms that are being called worse than Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana. It is horrific, right? And this is happening globally, obviously. This is a global system. And it's obviously the result of our capitalist system. This is out of control consumerism, out of control imperialism, which I feel is a stage of capitalism that is just completely rampant and unstoppable. And what's amazing is that it seems like, this is a worldwide protest movement as well. People are obviously very worried at the political inaction of our leaders taking menial steps like the Paris Accords, which if all of the governments, and this is non-binding, so if all of these world's governments actually did follow the steps and implement them, even though there's no actual regulations or rules forcing them to do so, just out of goodwill, which I don't believe that they're going to do, because there's no urgency, that will only curb us, I think, to 2 centimeters above baseline pre-industrial levels, which is not enough. The effects that we're seeing right now in the world is 1 centimeter degree above pre-industrial baseline levels. That's how crazy the weather patterns are just with that. So we're talking about 2 degrees, but realistically, if we continue on the same trajectory that we're at, we're looking at 3, 4, and possibly 5 degrees before the end of the century. And that's without things like the methane burp that could happen at any time, where these massive amounts of methane are released from the ocean that have been stored in these prehistoric like ice sheets and stuff like that. So it's pretty devastating. And the fact that the whole world has not gotten together to focus on this and this alone, of course, aside from the global pandemic that we're all facing, is just beyond my comprehension. And especially since you have all of these environmental organizations who are focused on this, and rightly so. And you see environmental films, and for the last 20 years, we've been kind of talking about this ever since An Inconvenient Truth came on the map. But no one has talked about it through the proper lens, which is the fact that the US empire and US military is the largest contributing factor to this problem, and not just this problem, but global pollution. The US military is the largest consumer of fossil fuels on the planet. And this is all like, it's really hidden data. If you actually dive into like the Pentagon's data and the military's data, it's very, very shrouded in mystery. They don't release a lot of this stuff, but one just has to look at, of course, the 800 plus bases around the world, the numerous wars and interventions the US is involved in, and extrapolate just the pollution just on one base alone to 800, and it just keeps going and going. And I mean, this issue is just so far reaching. I think the hardest part about the documentary is how are we going to focus it in on just a couple examples, which are really thousands and thousands that you can focus on.
So the Biden administration is basically saying things like this climate disaster does not present sufficient cause. I don't know if you had a chance to catch that while you were out doing your shooting, but this has gone around over the last few weeks because they lost their case before the Supreme Court to halt these gas and drilling leases on public lands. And then basically the Justice Department is just folding. So but that's not even involving the military. I mean, you're right to focus because there's a lot of groups that are paying close attention to the selling off of public lands to fossil fuel industry. But all we hear about, and maybe you can touch on this because I know it's going to be a part of your film. All you hear about are how the U.S. military is working to become, energy sufficient or energy efficient, and how they're going to. This is what I think Elizabeth Warren is focused on when it comes to the Pentagon, making them green so that they can be a green military. And I mean, obviously, that's not going to put much dent in what they're doing, right?
I mean, it's preposterous to even think that you can green the military. I mean, first of all of this military equipment is designed to run on fossil fuels. You're telling me that the war machine is going to take a breath and be like, you know what? Let's actually replace all of these fossil fuel machines with like solar panels and running on, like geothermal energy and make it way less efficient. There's a reason why these organizations and companies and militaries use fossil fuel, because it's extremely efficient and it does the trick, right? Way better than you would say solar energy or any of these other alternative energy sources. It's just true. So obviously they're not just going to change that, right? And also another point that I think is the biggest issue ever, if we're looking at like the IPCC recommendations, is the fact that militarism, not just from the United States, but from every single country involved, is omitted from every single climate agreement going back to the Kyoto Agreement. So how do you explain that, right? And if we're not talking about the elephant in the room, we're not really talking about the solutions here. But you look at people like Elizabeth Warren and people in the government, it's just this tacitly endorsed notion that the United States is a global empire and that it needs 800 military bases around the world. And if you're talking about throwing some solar panels on a particular base, what are we even talking about here? And that's not even going to happen. It's just a pie in the sky, hunky dory like solution, according to people who are just completely oblivious to the true nature of what this country is.
Yeah, and I think, you mentioned when you were beginning to talk about this, like there's all these environmental organizations that exist and they do good work, like pointing out that we need to do something about climate change. Here's why. But one issue they fail at is like it's really hard. You have to. I don't think I've ever seen like Greenpeace or like what do they call it, the Extinction Rebellion, or this, all of these sort of like foundation funded environmental organizations. I don't think I've ever seen them even touch on the topic of the issue of the Pentagon and how much pollution it causes. And I mean, to go even further, even the Green New Deal, I don't think the Green New Deal touches on this either. So it's like, again, it's why is it that even the sort of ostensibly progressive, pro-environmental, like climate change accepting and wanting to do something about it kind of organizations also don't seem to be touching this issue?
It's a really good point, and I feel like you could look at almost every issue that's propped up by like the liberal establishment darlings and stuff like that, and a lot of these organizations that are foundation funded, and they're completely siloed off from what I feel is the undercurrent beneath everything, which is the imperialist structure. Because, and I don't want to take away the work from people who are focusing on oil corporations. Of course, that is a huge component of this. But in my eyes, the only reason that big oil has so much power is because of the structure of imperialism, right? It's not just the United States military, it's the junior collaborators around the planet. It's the extraction of these resources. It's the stranglehold of things like oil and mineral wealth that we invade and occupy countries for. So all of these industries are intertwined with the United States empire, right? You can put the same boards of directorates from the oil corporations and the big media and our politicians probably all in like the same room, because it's actually not that many people that hold the power and are directing these things. But I mean, it's a great question, and I think the biggest answer to that is that a lot of it is not just foundation funded, but government grants as well,
Yeah.
that are doled out to organizations. You have people who don't want to upset the United States government because they want to appear palatable. They want to work in concert with the United States government. They want to start offering policy prescriptions and lobbying on the Hill. And if they actually approach what is the beast that is the overarching problem here, they're not going to get far, right? And I think that that's really the problem here, as well as ostracizing potential donors who are intertwined with the military, military families. There's we fetishize the military in this country, so who knows how many people you would really be ostracizing when you're trying to fold them in to what you're trying to do. But to me, it's a detriment. Because if you're not talking about what I feel is the biggest issue, then what are we even talking about here? You're really missing the boat, because again, this goes back to something that connects all of these issues together.
You're talking about imperialism being a stage of capitalism. It's a lot of these same organizations and just people in general who care about climate change won't touch capitalism, right? The actual economic structure that's causing all this. But I just want to make a comment really, and then Kevin, if you have a question, go for it. But like when you talk about the issue of oil and how it's efficient and it's just easy, I feel like I'm kind of living that now, because like Lebanon, I'm in Lebanon, and it's like there's all these electricity cuts, and they're completely related to not being able to access oil, which is what the electricity sector runs on here. And I don't think people realize like how much of their everyday, like every minute of your day is so dependent on fossil fuels. You have no idea. Like I have 13 hours of electricity a day if I'm lucky. And I'm like literally like my whole day revolves and is consumed by how much oil I'm getting into the generator, into this building. So it's just like an interesting, it's just interesting to think about it like that. Cause I don't think people realize like our entire system, our imperialism, capitalism, they're all completely revolving around this like substance that if it went away tomorrow, like nothing would be the same. Like in a way people can't really fathom, and we're not moving away from it at all.
No, there's no urgency whatsoever, even
No.
though we are facing like what we all know is happening. I mean, it's pretty astounding. I mean, these people have children and grandchildren. It's like they understand what their inaction is going to do, because we need to act now. And it's not just about lessening fossil fuels, it's actually completely removing ourselves from the dependency on fossil fuels. Otherwise, we're looking at, I mean, I can't even, like, there's no skipping around what is going to happen in 50 years. Like all of the glacial, like alpine glaciers are going to be fucking gone by 2100. Like, I don't think that these people can really wrap their minds around what is that going to do. It's not just sea levels rising, it's everything. Like, no one on the planet is going to be unaffected by climate change. So it's just crazy to me. Like, it's crazy to me that the main contributor is just like not giving a shit. And and the world follows us, right? If Biden came out tomorrow and said like, this is a serious thing and we all need to act accordingly, I feel like the rest of the world would follow suit. Because look, it's not just about emissions, even though you can look at something as small as one B-52 bomber, right? If it flies around the air for 1 hour unabated, that is equal to one person driving a car for 7 years straight. Wow. That's how much emissions just one B-52 bomber. But if you look at something like Iraq, like the decimation of a country with depleted uranium, something that has like a $2.5 billion half-life, which is as old as the Earth itself, you're looking at deforestation, the lack of sustainable agriculture, right? The lack of being able to actually construct a sustainable life for the people living on these countries that you have eradicated and decimated because of bombing, because of chemicals, burn pits. I mean, that's just one example. I mean, but it's just really, it's just shocking. It's shocking because if you just look at the environmental component and not even the human component, it's catastrophic.
Yeah, that brings to mind the mother of all bombs that Donald Trump was very pleased to be able to tell the world that his military was using, because I remember looking at the kind of devastation that had caused in Afghanistan, which didn't even enter any of the coverage when we were watching the withdrawal of U.S. military forces over the last month. We didn't talk about what happens because we dropped those kinds of bombs. But we really hope that this part where we are talking about your film can build and generate interest in it, and we want people to support it. So before we move on to other topics, let me give you an opportunity to maybe share a little bit. I know you were posting photos to your Twitter. We saw you on the glacier with Dar Jamail. Dar's been a good friend of the show over the past years. We've had him on multiple times. Tell us a little bit about partnering with Dar, and don't give away what you're doing for the film necessarily, but just
give it all away, all of it.
But tell us a little bit about being on this glacier and what you were doing in Alaska.
Yeah, well, there's a couple stories that I wanted to quickly tell you because it's really emblematic, I think, of the problem. Because Alaska is, one of these former, it's a territorial, essentially was a colony until not too long ago. And, half of Alaska's population is indigenous still. And there's this island called St. Lawrence Island, and you actually can see Russia from their doorstep. As just like Sarah Palin loved to say. And by the way, mind you, Sarah Palin was the governor of Alaska. So this is like how fucking backwards some of the components of this state are, because it has been basically taken over by conservative leadership. And because of that, a lot of it's been privatized. A lot of this natural wonder, majestic splendor of the things like the 80,000 glaciers in Alaska, some of them are privatized now by just these families who basically just treat them like their own stomping grounds. But so we visited an indigenous woman who is a tribal member and an elder of a certain tribe on St. Lawrence Island, which basically was used during the Cold War and World War II as a staging ground for the US military to spy on Russia because of its proximity to Russia. And it was just used as a toxic dumping ground. Tons of carcinogens that are forever chemicals. They're called forever chemicals because they literally do not go away. They've completely poisoned the entire landscape. The thing about this island is that it's not even designated by the EPA as a Superfund site, which there are 1,300 Superfund sites around the country, 900 of which are either hosting or previously hosted military needs. The other ones are mining and oil industry and all of that. And Superfund sites are considered so horrifically toxic that they are endangering human health and the environment right now. And that is why they are on the national priorities list to clean, like urgently clean. But there's so many thousands of more sites that the EPA, because it looks bad, right? And a governor needs to sign off if there's a Superfund site in the state. So of course people don't want this kind of black mark on their record. They don't want to reroute resources and funds to try to clean up these sites. Everything they can hide reality. And so even though there are 4 or 5 Superfund sites in Alaska, there are thousands of more military dump sites and toxic pollution sites that have been completely wiped away. And one of those is St. Lawrence Island, where, these indigenous people who live there are revered as the most resilient, powerful people in the world. They survived the harshest climate in the entire world, the Arctic. These people have been living there for like thousands of years. And this one woman, Vi, that we met, she just said, we used to live until we were 100 years old. We had this longevity that was all due to the food that we were eating. I mean, rich salmon that you're just pulling out of the ocean, blubber from whales and walruses and stuff like that. And she said basically ever since the military just dumped all of their garbage and carcinogens and just buried it, that was their solution to clean it up. They literally just buried it under like ice and dirt and left. And all of these people now are dying at 40, 50 years old, born with horrific birth defects, and the military is just denying it, right? And because they're expendable. They're expendable because they're indigenous and no one cares about them. And they live out in the middle of the Arctic. And so this woman telling us this story and just saying, all we can do now is pass on our language because we don't have any of the things that we can pass down to future generations in terms of how to sustain ourselves with these beautiful cultural rituals and how to live off the earth. She said none of that's possible anymore. The only thing that we can do to survive our culture is just teach our language and move out of this place, because it's become so toxic and there's no accountability whatsoever. We met this other woman, Pam Miller, from an organization called Alaska Community Actions on Toxics, an incredible woman out there fighting the good fight, basically exposing all these military dump sites in a really huge military community. I mean, everywhere you go in Alaska, the military is revered. There's tons of people living there. There's so many war games off the coast of Alaska, which is a whole other crazy issue. But it's so untouchable, right? And this woman has been harassed, sent death threats. She was called unpatriotic from her congresswoman because she simply is trying to like hold hearings and lobby for accountability for these PFAS chemicals, these degreasing chemicals that are like carcinogenic, that the military just dumps all over these communities in Alaska, and no one talks about it. And it's just absolutely horrifying when you peel back the layers of what's really going on, because I think when a lot of people think about Alaska, they think of this pristine, untapped, untouched wilderness, and really it is increasingly toxic and polluted and just essentially just been used as a dump site. And it really impacts the indigenous people who are living there. And of course, the Arctic warms 3 times faster than the rest of the planet because of where it is. And so they're all feeling the brunt of climate change, and they're feeling it right now. So it's, oh yeah, and to the glacier, this is another incredible story. I partnered with Dar Jamail, who was one of the first embedded reporters in Iraq. He has some really crazy stories. I mean, he saw the most horrific effects of depleted uranium. He saw babies being born with just absolutely insane birth defects, to the extent where Al Jazeera and other news agencies couldn't even run photos of what he was recording in these orphanages and stuff like that, because these sites are just essentially built on DU dump sites, and DU never goes away. And because of his war reporting, and then he transitioned over to climate change and wrote an incredible book called The End of Ice, which was a life-changing book for me. He really goes through how bad the situation really is, because it's sanitized to us, and I of course I know climate change is happening. I couldn't leave my house for 3 months last year because of the fires, but to the extent of how much it's going to impact, from everything from the coral reefs, which 1/3 of all marine life sustains on, to what the glaciers melting really means. I mean, Dar really spells it out in his book, and I was totally honored to have him come on board and be our guide. He was a mountaineer for many years. He's lived on glaciers 6 months of his life. And so he took us to the Matanuska Glacier to just document just one glacier of, the 80,000 that are melting very rapidly. There's a huge pool at the bottom that wasn't even there 20 years ago. The density is clearly receded so much. It's not just the lobe of the glacier that recedes, it's the actual, it shrinks, and, the density is just completely shrinks like 10 to 20 feet. And what was incredible about this glacier is that it's privatized. Like I said before, it's just owned by some random family who now charges like hundreds of dollars for a public tour. They charged us thousands of dollars to get on to film. And then they kicked us off before we knew that we had to leave, because they wanted to just trample around it and have a wedding for their friend on the glacier. And it's just, I think it just really symbolizes how disturbing this kind of privatization and takeover of public lands that has just exponentially increased the more Republicans take control of these states and national parks, and how detrimental that is to nature. And Dar was just totally beside himself. He was like, this is so fucked up. This is something that he spent months of his life on, and to see it now in the hands of just this random family that can kind of dictate whatever they want, I think it just really spells out that this problem is just it's so far reaching, and it's going to be really hard to solve, because when you've just sold off the land, it'd be hard to protect that land.
That is some of the most horrifying stuff I've ever. I don't even know how to you telling that story gives me chills. That's horrible. I don't even know what to do with that. What? And I think that's probably one of the biggest, I imagine, obstacles you're probably facing making this video. It's this ginormous monster of an issue, and it's how do you how do you present that to people in a way that will make them feel how they need to feel, because they need to feel like I need to do something immediately, because this is like human extinction level kind of stuff that we're talking about here. And it's like the people in charge are just kind of like, oh, let's have a wedding on a glacier. Like, what? Oh my God. Wow.
Yeah, no, it's surreal stuff. And I think that a lot of people don't give a shit about the environment. They think of it as their plaything. A lot of people believe in, fucking the apocalypse. It's like, you don't know the levels of kind of denial and who knows, like it's deep seated, right? The conditioning of just like to treat nature like your fucking dumping ground. But I think that when you talk about,
raised. Well, I was gonna say, I think it's because of like how we're raised. Like we're raised to be so disconnected from the environment, right?
Yeah.
Like, even me, I don't even want to go camping. I think it's just because maybe I don't know if it's an American thing, if it's a suburban thing. I'm not sure what it is, but like the idea of camping makes me cringe. And the idea of like being close to the ground or sleeping on it sounds disgusting to me, right? But like at the same time, it's like that's because of the culture I grew up in. It like you really are taught that like we're separate from nature around us. That's like something else that maybe you do as a hobby, but otherwise, like we're just like living in this weird plastic disconnected world where we're totally, at least growing up, like we were kind of removed from what was happening around us. Now it's kind of hard to be because, like you said, you have wildfires. The weather here is like insufferable in the summertime. It's too humid and hot to be outside. And it didn't used to be like that when I came to visit the Middle East or Lebanon when I was younger. There's these hurricanes. There's the flooding in New York. It's like getting closer, but we're still so disconnected from nature. And it's really sad. And it actually makes us depressed as a species to be disconnected from nature.
100%. That is absolutely the problem. The fact that we're still using these, plastic and styrofoam. Like, how is this happening
Like,
still
why?
in 2021? Like, why? I mean, it's beyond my comprehension. The fact that, this is just allowed to happen still, and that the problem has been individualized. The problem is this is a propaganda effort, very deliberately, on behalf of the ruling class, right, working in concert with these corporations who really are polluting the most, on behalf of the US government. And what's crazy about it is that we think it's our fault. We think that we haven't recycled enough, that we all need to buy Priuses, that we need to take one shower a week. All of the shit. It's like, we honestly are told, like, are you doing your part? And we're made to feel guilty. The burden is put on our shoulders as consumers, not Coca-Cola for dumping fucking 50 million water bottles in the ocean. I mean, it's disgusting, and it is a propaganda campaign. It absolutely is, because they don't want to point to the systemic issue. This is a systems issue. This is a capitalist issue. It's not us. It doesn't matter how many fucking Priuses we drive. It's not going to put a dent in the pollution put out by the US military on a daily basis.
Yeah, but like I have this bamboo toothbrush. I mean, the packaging said I was helping save the planet. I don't know what you're talking about.
They plant a tree for every shoe that you buy from Tom's Shoes.
Yeah.
It's fucking like, what is going on?
So what I'm hearing, Abby, is that you're not going to give us a PowerPoint presentation. That's not going to be Earth's greatest enemy, and you won't, at the end of it, tell us like a list of things we can do on like an individual level, like Al Gore.
Like to buy a T-shirt, like to buy an organic T-shirt with the movie's logo on it.
Yeah. I want to be able to go to the Gap and get like something I can wear to end militarism. That's going to be very disappointing.
Before we do move topics, though, I want to make sure you're able to tell people who are listening and watching like where they can support this effort.
Right. If I could just ask one more thing, because it came to my mind listening to you, and there's not a whole lot of people who know that this exists, and I'm actually curious if you were considering going there to talk to some of the scientists who have been bullied, harassed, and had their lives threatened. But listening to you speak made me think of the Hanford nuclear site that exists, I believe, in Washington. It's horrific. There's like a lot of details in this book by Tom Mueller called Crisis of Conscience about whistleblowers. And it's got one of the highest per capita rates of whistleblowers in the country, because there's so many people who have been hounded trying to expose what's going on there. And like at any moment, we could have like significant disaster happen. And I can imagine it's only exacerbated by the kinds of weather we're seeing in the climate. And so, anyways, just listening to you talk about how things like this have spiraled out of control, and thinking about the military, and I'm reminded of all the different places that there's waste stored as a result of our military actions that at any moment could be lost. Just like they could just spill out and cause tremendous disaster.
It's mind numbing, right? I mean, just the nuclear waste problem, the fact that we are actually refurbishing our nuclear arsenal to the tune of $1 trillion. And again, the US sets the stage. So if Biden announced that we're going to be working to build up our nuclear arsenal, then Russia's going to follow suit, right? And this is the problem, is it's just utter fucking lunacy. It's mind numbing. The nuclear waste and storage, and the fact that we are still continuing to generate new nuclear weapons. I mean, we're talking about hydrogen bombs, right? These have multiple, like 100 times stronger than the Hiroshima bomb. I mean, even if you were to, like, if there was a small scale nuclear war that only like 0.03 the amount of nuclear weapons that exist were detonated, it would completely destroy the planet and humans would go extinct, which actually might be suit us better. You know, we shouldn't wait for climate change. Maybe we should just end ourselves that way, because it's like, it's just fucking unbelievable. But yes, Kevin, I mean, the thing about this movie is that we want to do so much. And it all depends on how much we can raise. We're about 60% funded right now, $60,000 out of $100,000, and we want to go big. I mean, there's Guam, there's Puerto Rico, there's the territorial empire, but then it expands to the global empire, which is Okinawa, Jeju Islands. These struggles to demilitarize their own communities. Whether it's Okinawa, which is basically one giant military base, they're building another base that's decimating a rare blue coral reef. You have the geoparks in Jeju Islands, which are the unique biodiversity that only exists there, nowhere else in the world, that are just being decimated by the construction of US bases. So there's so much you can cover. There's the, demilitarizing efforts in the Philippines. But yeah, when you're looking at just nuclear weapons, that's definitely a component that we want to cover, because that really puts everything else aside, because it's I mean, that is the biggest issue next to climate change, is the potential for a nuclear war. And the fact that these weapons still exist and we're actually constructing more is unbelievable. And there's no discussion on the political level of actually nuclear, like basically let's dismantle our nuclear programs and let's try to move beyond the notion of nuclear weapons, because it's total fucking lunacy. And all you see are these policy prescriptions from think tanks and defense contractors just saying, no, here's a reason why we need more.
Brought to you by Lockheed Martin.
Yeah.
But what you were talking about, all the places you want to go, I mean, that's like you have to, the travel costs, the lodging cost, because you need fixers, you need translators, there's so much that goes into each little project that goes into a massive project. So where can people go to support this film?
So it's Earth's Greatest Enemy. Let me say it again, earthsgreatestenemy.com. Check it out. You can donate a number of ways. We decided to not do like a Kickstarter or something, because if you don't fund the whole thing, you get nothing. And it's kind of crazy the way that they do that. So we're just, yeah. So we're just doing it, just direct donations. You can, so you can check that out on the website and donate to us a number of ways. But yeah, I mean, these things cost money. We already spent quite a bit of money just, with the crew in Alaska. But one last point before we move on, a lot of people don't care about the environment, which is completely tragic and really exposes how we are totally removed from who we are. We are the environment. We are just primates that have evolved, we are truly animals that belong to the earth. And we do live off the earth, whether we want to believe that or not. But I think that the way that we can reach the majority of people in this country is showing them the callous disregard for human life that the US military has for its own people, right? Because this isn't just indigenous people, in Alaska, in the Arctic. This isn't just people who are Iraqis, which is tragic if you actually don't care about those people. But we know, sadly, a lot of people are very hyper nationalistic and really believe that the US military cares about this country and acts on our behalf. And I think if you just look at two examples, one is Camp Lejeune in Jacksonville, North Carolina, and this is a Marine base that again was dumping these forever chemicals for decades. I mean, the list goes on of the toxic chemicals that they knew were dumping in, and a lot of these Superfund sites, including Camp Lejeune, it saturates the waterbeds. And it just completely spills out like a Flint situation where it just completely penetrates the drinking water for miles and miles and miles. And you can't fix something like that. Once it's penetrated the soil and the earth and the groundwater, that's not an easy fix. That is going to have horrific, devastating effects for the communities that live there. And so Camp Lejeune, thousands and thousands of people have been dying from cancer. So many babies and children under the age of 5 have died, and so many miscarriages and birth defects that there's actually a graveyard nearby that's called Baby Heaven because of how many children are buried there. And, you know, looking at how the US politicians have responded to this, they just completely denied it for decades and decades until Barack Obama finally was like, okay, we're actually going to finally pay out some of these claims. And it lasted like 2 years. And then they said, you know what, we don't want to do this anymore. So people are still fighting. And, you know, Coldwater Creek, something that Cori Bush talks about frequently. This is another thing that's happening in Missouri. This is a holdover from World War II of nuclear waste that was poisoning this creek bed that thousands of children played in. Again, just horrific, devastating effects of cancer and other debilitating illnesses, and the government denied it for generations. And it's not just remnants of the Cold War and World War II. Again, these PFAS, these forever chemicals that are dumped into waterbeds today, this foam that the US military is discreetly trying to incinerate all across the United States in hundreds of different locations, that is going to have devastating impacts for the environment and communities that live there as well.
Wow.
There's no longer any debate to be had. Our planet is on a collision course with disaster.
Urgent warnings.
Dangerous, record-breaking heat.
We're now living in the early stages.
Terrifying signs of things to come.
Mass displacement, deaths, and extinctions are already here. Whether the planet can remain habitable for human beings has become a haunting question.
Climate change protests happening right now.
Part of a global call for action.
We know there are many culprits: corporations, policymakers, mass consumption. But what if there was one single entity that by itself will bring planetary collapse? One single organization, one single enemy, that not only produced enough toxic destruction to destroy the planet on its own, but was also subject to virtually no regulations, no oversight, no accountability, and as of yet, no blame. If there was a monster like that, shouldn't it be dragged out of the dark and into the center of the struggle to save the planet?
I mean, I do have to say, I think you're such a good person to be involved in a project like this because you're really effective at explaining how dire it is. Like just hearing you talk about these various places, it's like I feel fired up about it. So that's
Good.
that's positive. That's positive because I think that this might be a good segue into a topic that I think is important and tangentially related to this, and that is like, you know, the people who really are the ones who like would be, you know, pushing this narrative and kind of like helping educate those around them on an issue like this are American leftists. And I actually wanted to kind of ask you a little bit about the state of the American left right now, because I feel like we're in a moment where people are feeling really helpless and powerless. And as a result, like sometimes, and very online, because we're like in this pandemic where everyone's kind of like isolated in their homes, maybe not as much now, but before they were. And so we're kind of in this moment where it feels like the online left, at least, which I guess, is what, gets talked about as the American left. It's kind of like in this fight where they don't know how to respond to power. Like we have these people in Congress who are sometimes really useful. You mentioned Cori Bush. I thought like what she did with the eviction moratorium a few months ago was important and effective and actually did work to like halt evictions for a little bit. And then, people like AOC who wore that the tax the rich dress, and that was like the talk of the town for like a week. And I thought it was a little bit stupid that people like went after her so hard for that. But then at the same time, like yesterday, which we're recording this happened yesterday, there was like this amendment in Congress about funding the Israeli Iron Dome, which the US funds to literally shield Israel from rockets from the people they're occupying, from the consequences of occupying an entire people. They decided to fund this with another $1 billion. And rather than vote against it, she voted for it, though she cried. But I guess
it was really hard for her.
It was very difficult for her. And that's honestly been weighing on me all day. Like, I mean, Palestinians.
I hope she's
okay.
I hope she's okay.
Has anyone checked on her?
Has anyone checked on her?
It's very traumatic to vote in Congress these days.
Yeah, she cried, you guys. She cried. Although I kind of think that was like fake. But anyway, I guess my question for you to say for this whole rant is just to ask, like, and it's kind of a big question. It might be difficult to answer, but how do we engage with the situation we're in right now, where it really does feel like you have this ruling class that is just so in charge and so in control, and there's nothing we can do about it. And you have some people in Congress who might be useful, but we're not quite sure how to make them useful, but we're still stuck in this like monopoly system of these two parties that are really just the same, that make it impossible to change anything. Like, how do we move forward on this issue in the circumstances that we're in?
I mean, it's the fucking question of the day, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I tell myself every day. I'm like, what are we going to do about this? It just seems to get worse every day. I mean, I think that there's so many facets to it. Like, first, the dissolution of the Bernie movement. Now it seems like this kind of left bloc, which was largely unified behind Bernie Sanders, and really for the first time felt like there could be some electoral victory that really could change the conditions of the working class with some executive orders if he got into office very rapidly, which would have been really amazing. And that just completely fell apart. And now there's this rudderless, kind of, I don't know, like movement that is so splintered and fractured upon splinters and fractures that already existed before. And then we've turned in on each other and kind of pointed fingers at each other. It's like that Spider-Man meme where it's like, it's just unbelievable. It's unbelievable. I mean, I have ever since Michael Brooks died, and I already was feeling this way about my use of time engaging, on Twitter and social media and stuff like that, because let's face it, the revolution is not going to happen on Twitter, as much as Twitter wants to tell us that was responsible for the Arab Spring and is promoted as like this revolutionary tool. Like, big tech curates our reality, it sanitizes what it doesn't want us to see, and we need to really remove ourselves from these spaces and start talking to our neighbors and people in the streets and organizing accordingly, because none of this shit is going to happen online. They would love us to just be trapped online and fucking arguing with each other to the end of time. And that's sadly what's happening. And what's sad is that a lot of people have capitalized on these divisions for feeding the algorithm, YouTube clicks, knowing that it's extremely destructive. It's destructive to do, but it maybe facilitates their growth and helps them get more popular and viral. And that, I think, is hugely problematic. And so you have that component of it, which is really, really disturbing.
Abby, you just speaking of politicians, I feel like it's a good opportunity to to bring up the fact that there's one that you were very correct about the last year and a half or so.
Oh, fuck me.
Well, there was Tulsi Gabbard, and with Tulsi Gabbard is an interesting character, right? Because she was like on her way to Democratic Party stardom, and then she like stopped everything she was doing, and she endorsed Bernie Sanders in 2016, and the Democratic Party hated her for it, and then she became, for whatever reason, and we can talk about the reason, she became anti-war in Syria, anti-intervention in Syria, when nobody else in Congress was saying a word about that. Which automatically gave her some likability from some people, including myself. I mean, I was impressed to see that. That's one thing that I was like, okay, this person's interesting. But you were one of the people who was very early on like, no. Like, this woman is right wing. And I think this week, the last couple weeks at least, like I mean, I've talked to you about this before, and it's been obvious for a while that she's quite right wing, but she just came out like swinging this week or last week, I can't remember, when she was like, hey guys, I've been gone because I was in Africa on a counter-terror mission because I'm still in the military, and also Iran has Islamists and they're bad. And you're like, what? So I'm just, I want to give you the opportunity to gloat. Actually, I feel like you deserve it, because you really were one of those voices who was like very adamantly like this woman. And I think it was difficult for some people to parse through too, because she was being attacked by the establishment for unfair reasons. Like,
exactly.
You were attacking her for correct reasons. She was being attacked because people were like, you're an agent of Russia because you don't support the war in Syria. So I think it made it very easy for a lot of people on the left to be like, oh, wow, like they're just attacking her because she's anti-war. But anyways, I wanted to give you the floor for a moment to like have your say, because I think she's the perfect example also of like, even if she had been a right winger and suddenly turned left, which isn't the case, she's just another example of like, you cannot put your trust in politicians and like worship them. But go ahead.
Well, I'm taking apologies. I can do a vindication tour if anyone wants to have me on their podcast to apologize to me for harassing me for 2 years.
You were harassed.
I got so fucked with, dude. I got so trolled. And look, the thing about Tulsi is I get where people wanted to believe. Right? Yeah. Of course. I mean, who doesn't want to think that we have some really staunch anti-regime change advocate up there, an anti-war candidate, you know? I mean, to me, I saw through it from the beginning because I looked back at who she was in the lead up to the Democratic primary. And I'm sorry, if you're advocating the use of torture in 2014, you know, like the ticking time bomb scenario, that's a huge fucking red flag to me. You know, this is known. Torture doesn't work, and torture is a war crime, and like in no circumstances is it okay. I don't care what kind of 24 fucking, you know, Donald Sutherland like type like spy scenario that you're proposing. And that's unfortunately what she did. And she was also criticizing Obama from the right about how he wasn't using the word Islamic terrorism when he was calling out, you know, certain things that were wrong. So there was a huge red flag at the beginning. And the thing is, yes, of course you can turn left wing, and yes, of course you can denounce these bad beliefs, but she never did that. She never had a moment of reckoning where she said, you know what, I was wrong on torture. I was wrong giving a speech next to Netanyahu or whatever the fuck that AIPAC sponsored speech that she gave in like 2015 too. Like, I was wrong. Here's when I changed. And when you just kind of wipe away and sweep under the rug your previously really bad and incorrect beliefs and just pretend like they never existed, that's when I had a problem with it. And so I always just kind of was suspicious of it. And I think that I was vindicated. I mean, her mask came completely off in the last couple of weeks in terms of how she's not really anti-war at all. She made very clear, especially in the wake of that drone bombing that horrifically killed that entire family, 7 children or something like that. She basically just justified the use of drones. She was like, look, the loss of civilian life is bad, war is hell, but it's necessary. And would you rather have us invade and occupy nations, or would you rather have us do these targeted strikes, which, as we know, kill 90% innocent people at the very least? So I thought that was really unfortunate. And then she says, you know, she was busy. I mean, first of all, she's a fucking active duty military person. Like, yeah. Like, why? I mean, if you're anti-military, leave the military, like Mike did, right? If Mike were just still in the military, but he was going around being like, I'm anti-war, people would be like, well, what the fuck are you doing? Are you going to leave the military or not? Like, it's totally insane, you know? Like, it doesn't make any sense.
I'm super anti-war, but I'm going to get deployed again.
Yeah, he's like, I can't wait to go to Africa with these, like, and then she's in Africa bragging about it, being like, sorry, guys, I was just really busy taking out the Islamists, the Islamist terrorists in Africa. It's like, who are these people? Who are these people that you're killing? You're judge, jury, executioner, overseeing like night raids and special op like massacres of like random people in Africa. I'm sorry, I don't agree with that. Within reason.
Really good. Let's put the website back up again for people. And this is where you can go to support this wonderful, awesome documentary, which I assume we'll be following the production with you and other people as it winds its way to being edited and ready for release.
Yeah, absolutely. Sign up for mailing list updates too, because that's really how, like, going back to the solution here, that's how we need to be interacting with each other, is just like mailing lists. Because
that's actually the best way. That way
thank you so much for having me on. It was awesome to talk to y'all, and I really appreciate the time.
Thank you so much, Abby. This was wonderful.
Once again, here's a reminder to support the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast by going to our Patreon or Rockfin or finding us on Spotify. On Patreon, we're at patreon.com/unauthorized disclosure. On Rockfin, you can subscribe to our channel at rockfin.com/unauthorized dis. And on Spotify, all you have to do is find our show, Unauthorized Disclosure, and become a paid subscriber. Each of these ways get you access to full episodes of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast, and it helps us keep producing this independent show. Thank you. We'll be back soon with more Unauthorized Disclosure.